I just wanted to provide some links for teaching growth. You probably have heard about these because you guys are in physics, but I wanted to bring up, for example, the PhET interactive simulations. They have been translated a lot into different languages. Unfortunately, they don't have closed captioning, so that's one thing as well. And I think another thing to be mindful of is students who have color blindness. So it's a big thing in chemistry, but there are certain apps that you can link into your syllabus and things like that for students with accessibility concerns or visual concerns and things like that. And then there's also open source tutorials and other opportunities for educators to incorporate other things that are not just simply from the textbook, or also not just things that are static. So having like motion and imagery and things like that is important, especially for concepts like physics and chemistry. And so I think the biggest thing with trying to start with diversity, equity, inclusion in the classroom is just, working on personal growth. So the biggest principle within this sort of paradigm is the vulnerability that's involved in doing diversity, equity, inclusion, because you have to relate to your students in a way. You have to, think of your students as people who are not just like, that are more than just, students who come to the classroom. So considering the needs that they might, the concerns that they might have, or the needs that they need to have addressed. And so these are sort of like a collection of, books and podcasts and things like that I think would be really useful if you're really interested in this journey of like, how do I become more knowledgeable on these topics? Because again, diversity, equity, inclusion is not just about race. It's, dealing with LGBTQ rights and things like that. There actually was a post in the Strategies for Chemistry Teaching that talked about how the professor was really upset because they had moved their, a student had emailed them rushing and being like, I can't take your final because I'm getting married that day. And the professor was like really upset about it, and they posted, and somebody had commented like, well, maybe they're losing their right to get married in the near future. And so the notion of time and access is something that isn't universal for all students. So being mindful of that, especially during times like this, is important, because unfortunately, like our political atmosphere is imposing and intersecting with education. And if your education is not affected by politics, that is inherently a privilege. And so these are some other books, Why Are All Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? So this sort of dismantles ideas of like stereotype threat. So there's a lot of, so stereotype threat is a very cognitive concept, which is important, but it's also mindful to acknowledge that these things are socially constructed as well. So it's not to put it on the individual of like, oh, they just need to raise their confidence and they can succeed. And also it creates this notion of normativity where we're trying to take like, using essentially white male students as the standard and bringing other groups to that. So be careful, it's called gap gazing. We don't want to, use that as this normative idea of like, oh, we just need to raise people like this, but instead we need to be challenging like what this standard even means and why we have it to begin with. And so this is another book that really goes into a lot of the history of these dynamics. So things like redlining, I had talked about a little bit earlier, things like how your high school experience can be heavily impacted and heavily changed depending on where you go to school. And that affects things like math preparation, which is a really big thing in physics. And so talking about how like math education can be race, classed, and gendered.